I'm joined now to debate this by former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner, who says Trump and co. could one day be held criminally liable in a court of law, and by Paul Butler, also a former federal prosecutor, who's not a fan of that approach, I think it's fair to say. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with me. Glenn, let me start with you. Owen Redlener of Columbia just said if he was an ordinary citizen, he would be prosecuted. This would be a crime, what he's overseen. Can Donald Trump, when he leaves office in January 2021, be prosecuted, in your view, for crimes related to his mishandling of COVID-19?
Mehdi, he can, he should, and he must. As a 30-year prosecutor, 22 of those years handling murder cases in Washington, D.C., the evidence I have seen leads me to conclude that Donald Trump's behavior easily fulfills the three legal elements of involuntary manslaughter. They are: he acted in a grossly negligent manner, that grossly negligent conduct was reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury to another, and he thereby caused the death, with causation in the law being defined as conduct that is a substantial factor in bringing about the death. And Mehdi, we just had some blockbuster reporting from an emergency room nurse in South Dakota, and she added dying declarations to the evidentiary mix because she said her patients have been telling her, in fact, arguing with her and yelling at her that they do not have COVID. Donald Trump said it was a hoax. He said, I have nothing to worry about. He deceived them into believing there was no or little threat. And she said, my patients continue yelling at me until they are being intubated and they can no longer yell. All of that evidence in combination easily supports a manslaughter charge.
Paul, you're a former prosecutor like Glenn. Would you try and prosecute Donald Trump in a court of law? Would you say this is a case I can win? I can pin on him?
I wouldn't. I'm all for holding Trump accountable for his corruption and obstruction. After he leaves office, prosecutors will have an embarrassment of riches, but it's really important that they bring the right case, and I don't think it's this one. The big legal issue is causation. When a prosecutor charges homicide, she has to prove that the defendant is legally responsible for the death. So normally it's not a problem. Most negligent homicide is about people who accidentally kill. But here, the theory will be that Trump's not revealing to the American people all he knew about the pandemic, or not taking stronger steps to stop the virus. It's like a drunk driver crashing into someone. I think that's a stretch. To win, a prosecutor would have to get 12 jurors to agree beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump personally caused the death of someone whose autopsy report is not going to say homicide, it's going to say COVID-19. So Glenn's a legendary homicide prosecutor, but I'm not sure even he could win this case.
Glenn, the causation is a stretch.
The causation isn't a stretch, and I disagree with Paul that I'm a legendary prosecutor. I also disagree with Paul that I couldn't win the case. And Paul knows his way around the courtroom. And here's where I agree with Paul. There's an embarrassment of criminal riches. There's so much to go after Donald Trump for. However, death is different. That's a quote from a Supreme Court opinion. So the people who have been victimized by Donald Trump's lies, particularly as captured and revealed by Bob Woodward in those tapes, they scream out for justice. They scream out for accountability. And remember, causation, as Paul mentioned, doesn't mean you shot somebody and killed them, you stabbed them, you strangled them. It means your conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the death. That's the evidentiary burden I would have to overcome, and I could do it in court.
You know, I think
Paul,
the problem...
let me put this to... No, go on, Paul. Sorry, go on.
So the problem is that the defense is going to say, well, look at New York City, look at D.C., look at California. So even in states where the elected leaders were responsible, people are still dying. It's certainly the case that Trump's shameful lack of leadership has caused lives, but it's much more difficult to say it caused one particular life. which is what a prosecutor would have to prove. And really quickly, the other concern is about the appearance of justice. I think it's dangerous to start making bad political decisions a crime, even really bad political decisions. The appropriate remedy is what Americans just did, to vote him out. But I worry that when we start going after elected officials for on-the-job decisions, we're kind of playing Donald Trump's game. We're getting close to the kind of political prosecution that he's always encouraging. We just shouldn't replace lock her up with lock him up unless we have really credible evidence of a crime.
I mean, Paul, people would say, well, they have voted him out. He lost the election, but there's still no justice for the people who have died. But Glenn, deal with Paul's point there about elected leaders. Why only Trump? Where do you draw the line? I mentioned at the start of the show Jared Kushner and Scott Atlas and people around him, the Christine Ohms in South Dakota. But what about in New York, where the same Columbia University studies that say Trump basically has blood on his hands also suggest that Governor Andrew Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio also have blood on their hands in effect, because had they acted sooner there, had they not told people to go out and eat and act normally, a lot of people would have lived in New York who died. So where do you draw the line, Glenn?
That's a great question, Mehdi. And I never made prosecutorial decisions based on somebody's political affiliation. And when it comes to line drawing, here's how lines get drawn. You go into the grand jury and you present all of the evidence that may implicate anybody in criminal activity. And then the grand jury, sitting as the conscience of the community, will have to make some difficult decisions about where criminal liability lies and where it does not. They're guided by the prosecutor's recommendations. But if a prosecutor is doing his or her job honestly, they're not going to walk in and try to indict a ham sandwich. They're going to present all of the evidence to the grand jury, and then the grand jury, sitting as the conscience of the community, will decide who should be charged.
One last question before we run out of time. Paul, you mentioned, voting him out of office and political accountability, not just legal. But the problem is, it's not just what Trump has done in the past, it's what he's doing right now, even after being voted out of office during the lame duck period. In a press conference today, President-elect Joe Biden talked about the dangers of Trump refusing to have a proper transition in terms of public health. Have a quick listen.
What do you see as the biggest threat to your transition right now, given President Trump's unprecedented attempt to obstruct and delay a smooth transfer of power?
More people may die if we don't coordinate.
Isn't that the problem, Paul, that it's all very well saying politics will deal with this, but we had an election, he lost, and yet he's still, in a sense, getting people killed?
That's right. And the reality is that elections have consequences. And one of the consequences of the election of Donald Trump in 2016 is that he doesn't listen to science. He apparently didn't experience the Enlightenment. He doesn't listen to rationality. Everything that's bad politics isn't a crime. And one of the reasons that we got this mass incarceration in the United States now is by looking at every problem as an opportunity for prosecution. The political system has fixed this. I agree, not nearly quickly enough, but I think that's the appropriate result for COVID. Now, there'll be, again, many opportunities for obstruction of justice, for his corruption, for the Ukraine investigation, campaign finances, just not this case. Happy to join my buddy Glenn, co-counsel prosecuting for any number of other crimes.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. I'm sure we'll talk about those other crimes in the coming weeks. Glenn Kirshner and Paul Butler, thank you so much, both of you, for your legal insights.